Our first session this afternoon is crop responses to hazy conditions. Dr. Alexander Lindsey from Ohio State University. Dr. Lindsey is an associate professor of crop ecophysiology in the Department of Horticulture and Crop Science. Since joining the faculty in 2015, he has focused on how crops interact with environmental factors to influence growth and yield. He also teaches courses on crop production, plant physiology, and seed science, and serves as the coordinating advisor of the Agronomy specialization of Sustainable Plant Systems major. Dr. Lindsey received his PhD in agronomy from Ohio State University in 2015 under Dr. Peter Thompson, and has been a certified crop advisor since 2009, and has received his BS and Master's from Michigan State University. Please welcome Dr. Alexander Lindsey for his online virtual presentation on crop responses to hazy conditions.
Hey, I appreciate the introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. So hopefully you should all see the presentation now. Really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with you remotely today. I have no problems traveling north during kind of December. A couple years ago, I was in South Dakota, but because my wife was already traveling to Iowa, I wasn't able to come and be in person with you. But this topic is of interest to me. It's something that we've been dealing with to some degree in Ohio. And hopefully this presentation will help to answer some questions, if you have any, about this topic, or help to enlighten you to the conditions that we've been seeing. I teach about this in our physiology class. I'm actually 50% teaching, and so some of this actually comes from the course that I teach related to plant physiology. So I apologize if it starts off being a little bit like a lecture, but at the same time, it will help to contextualize how crops respond to these types of conditions. When we talk about haze, the primary reason that we think about this, at least in recent years, has been from wildfire smoke and concerns related to that. Some of the other issues that we can see with wildfires include things like particle themselves, ash, soot, materials. If those come down on the crop, could that influence it? In general, if we're seeing particles come down, that could cover the leaf tissue to some degree, but oftentimes those physical particles have some sort of minerals included with them in that ash material, and so there can actually be a slight nutritive effect from having some of those particles present. The bigger concern from a crop production standpoint is usually the gases that can come from those wildfire smokes themselves. Carbon dioxide and water vapor are the primary ones. When you're burning things, those are the two main gases emitted. But ones that could be of concern include carbon monoxide, ozone, and dioxins themselves. So the major issue with these gases is that they can cause negative influence on plants and plant growth and development. But in general, the farther you get from the source of that fire, the more those gases tend to dissipate, and the less of a direct effect they can have on the crops that are in the surrounding areas. And so in general, the concentration closest to the fire is probably going to be most influenced by those types of things. But as we get farther removed from the source of the haze and we start to feel the effects just from the plumes that have entered into the upper atmosphere, the larger concern we're probably dealing with is light and light availability. In general, when we talk about hazy conditions, it's usually because the light is becoming more scattered and possibly reduced in intensity. And so the majority of this presentation is going to be focusing on the radiation component and light aspect and how that influences crop yields. So we can think about canopy production or yield as kind of the gains from photosynthesis and losses from that from respiration and respirative processes. In general, the photosynthetic components are going to outgain the respiration, yielding to net growth, development, and seed yield. But when we think about canopy photosynthesis, there's kind of a few aspects associated with this. In general, we're talking about conversion efficiency of photosynthesis to yield. In general, we're talking about grain, things like that. So that conversion from photosynthesis to productivity, I have it here as dry matter yield, but we could call that grain yield. That would be something like the harvest index or the conversion efficiency from biomass to yield components. But when we think about photosynthesis, there's two factors that are going into this. The first factor is conversion efficiency. So the light that a plant is absorbing, how much of that is going into photosynthesis to go into that carbon capture process. And of the factors in canopy level photosynthesis, that tends to be the lesser of the two factors. The greater factor is usually light interception, or the ability of the plant canopy to intercept as many photons as possible. And so that tends to be the bigger driver of photosynthesis. But before we move on from this aspect, we're going to focus in a little bit more on this leaf photosynthesis concept to understand how changing light intensity influences productivity. We can look at how a leaf will photosynthesize in response to light being added through measurement of carbon dioxide either released or absorbed by the leaf tissue. And this curve is kind of showing one of these typical types of curves that we can get. This is called a light response curve. On the x-axis, we have light intensity going up. On the y-axis, we have CO2 being incorporated into the biomass. When we have no light present, in general, the leaf is just respiring, and so we have a net negative photosynthetic rate, which makes sense. It's just letting CO2 out, not bringing CO2 in. But as we increase light intensity, we see that photosynthetic rate begin to increase, and it increases kind of at a steady state until it gets to about this midway inflection point. After that point, adding additional light does not necessarily improve productivity and improve photosynthesis of the leaf tissue. At this inflection point, we tend to think of the leaf being CO2 limited, being there's more energy available than the leaf can use because there's not enough CO2 present for it to bring in to effectively use all of that. When we see adding light to the leaf tissue doesn't gain any additional photosynthesis occurring, we call that the light saturation point of the leaf. And so in general, we can add more photons, but it doesn't necessarily mean more photosynthesis is going to occur. That light saturation point can change with CO2 levels. In general, if we have low CO2 levels, we see that light saturation point occurring sooner, meaning adding more light beyond a certain intensity is not going to improve productivity. We can push that point farther to the right, meaning it can use more light energy if there's higher CO2 levels available in the plant canopy. And so this isn't necessarily just about ambient CO2 in our atmosphere. It's usually more focused in on what's available within the leaf tissue or in the surrounding plants and what's available for it to absorb at any given point in time. We can look at a similar curve, but instead of looking at that being light limited or light intensity, we can look at how the photosynthesis will change with CO2 concentration. In general, if CO2 concentrations within leaf tissue get to be at 100 or less parts per million, CO2 and photosynthesis will essentially stop. It won't really do any types of activities. And so it does need some CO2 available for it to be able to do photosynthesis. So in general, below about 450 parts per million CO2 inside of the leaf tissue, we tend to think of those leaves as being CO2 limited. If there's higher CO2 levels available, it can use extra light and do more photosynthesis in response to that. And so the point of showing these two response curves is to understand that in some cases, adding more light is not necessarily going to improve productivity. And during the day, at any given point in time, we can see CO2 levels above the plant canopy change. As the leaves start to photosynthesize and are incorporating a lot of that CO2, it's not uncommon to see the CO2 levels above a plant canopy, either corn or soybeans, drop to somewhere between 275 and 300 parts per million at any given point during the day. And this trend holds true through multiple days of the year. We can see this midday drop in CO2 levels as the canopy is actively absorbing and incorporating that CO2. And so if our CO2 levels are low outside, it's very likely that they're going to be at a similar level inside, meaning that they could be more or less CO2 limited rather than being light limited at that given point in time. And so the main takeaway here is that more light doesn't necessarily always mean more productivity because of this association between being CO2 limited and being light limited. Our crops also don't respond the same way to this change in light intensity. In general, C4 photosynthetic plants are different than C3 plants in their light response curves, meaning that it takes a little bit more energy for them to do their photosynthetic process because they're essentially bringing CO2 into their cells twice, once in the mesophyll cells and then once again with rubisco, whereas C3 plants are just doing it once with the rubisco enzyme itself. And so the break-even energy point is slightly higher for C4 plants. But because they're able to super concentrate CO2 in their bundle sheath cells where rubisco is, very rarely do they become limited by having not enough CO2 present. So that CO2 limitation is less, and they're able to push that light saturation point farther to the right compared to what we'd see in C3 plants. And so it's possible reduced light intensity could negatively affect C4 plants more so than C3 plants. But at the same time, we know that this is under steady state light conditions. If light conditions start to fluctuate or change, as we can see with like clouds moving across the sun, we know that the upper end of productivity can be recovered fairly quickly for C3 plants, as we see in the red dots. But for C4 plants, generally these take a little bit longer to recover in fluctuating light conditions. And so what we see is if you go from really intense light to low intensities back to more intense, we see productivity kind of dip across the board for most of our C4 plants. It takes them longer to get back up to full productivity when you're going through this rapid fluctuation in high intensity to low intensity. Part of it is because of the higher metabolic pool and diffusion that has to go from cell to cell in these C4 plants. And so in some ways, it's possible that if light intensity is reduced some, but it's not as fluctuating, that may not necessarily hurt C4 plants as much as we might expect. But if we go from like really cloudy to full sun, kind of in those partly cloudy days, that can be more detrimental to C4 productivity. The other thing to keep in mind with regards to light response in plants is that it can change depending on the condition where the leaf finds itself. For the same type of plant, this is a sun-loving plant or a shade-avoiding plant, if that leaf is grown under full light conditions, we see a curve very similar to what we saw for the C4 plant. In general, the more light that it's given, the more photosynthetic productivity it has, and we reach a light saturation point somewhere between 1,300 and 1,500 micromoles per meter squared per second intensity. But if we grow that same plant under lower light conditions, about 10% of the initial light intensity, we see a change in that photosynthetic curve. So plants can adjust to the light intensity in which they find themselves, and they're going to essentially do less with the light that they have. And so the light compensation point is a little bit lower, and they're doing less with the photons that they're having. They also cost less energy to maintain. If plants are grown in lower light intensities, we can also see changes in how the leaves are oriented and what they look like. In general, under high light intensities, we tend to see leaf areas are smaller, but leaves tend to be thicker. And the point of doing that is that they have more mesophyll in the palisade layers, able to capture light intensity and convert it into photons, or from photons into carbon dioxide containing molecules. CO2 molecules become incorporated into sugars. And so we have thick parenchyma layers, palisade parenchyma layers. The leaves tend to be thicker, but they're narrower, allowing more light to penetrate deeper into the plant canopy. We see some changes in their chloroplasts and how they're interacting with the light. And we see high amounts of rubisco content, but also these protective compounds of carotenoids, flavonoids, and photooxidative detox systems tend to be greater and more active in those types of leaves, meaning that they understand that they're going to have really intense sunlight that they can't use 100% of the time for photochemistry. And so they have to dissipate that energy somehow. And it's better to dissipate it using carotenoids and flavonoids than having the reactive oxygen species form and destroy everything inside of those leaf tissues. But if plants are growing under lower light intensities, we can see some slight changes in their leaf architecture. In general, there'll be larger leaf areas, but the leaf thickness will be less. They won't invest as much in those palisade parenchymal layers, and they'll start to change how they orient their chloroplasts, trying to capture every photon they can rather than knowing they're going to have enough and letting some come through. In general, if leaves are grown under more shady conditions, the carotenoid and flavonoid content is going to be lower, and they won't have as many enzymes around to deal with reactive oxygen species. And so the metabolic draw to go towards these other areas may be less if growing under lower light intensity. And so all of these things come into play when we think about haze impact on plants, plant growth and development, and photosynthesis. So the other thing that contributes to plant canopy photosynthesis, aside from the leaf level, is light interception ability. And light interception of the canopy is influenced by two factors, one of which is canopy architecture, how those leaves are distributed, but also the total available light. In general, when we think about the canopy architecture, its ability to capture photons is really important for net productivity. In general, having a canopy like the one that's kind of on the middle of the slide is really important so that each leaf is maximizing its productivity as much as possible. By shifting light interception deeper in the crop canopy, that can affect every individual leaf's ability to photosynthesize, whereas in the top, if the upper leaves are intercepting 100% of the light, those leaves are going to be operating on that light response curves way beyond that light saturation point. They're not going to be able to use all of the photons that they're absorbing in the first place. Whereas the lower leaves in that canopy are underfed, and they could be doing more if given the light supply. And so if leaves are changed in the canopy to look more like the lower part, each of the leaves in each of the tropic layers of that canopy are operating closer to that break-even point, which is really important. The other thing to keep in mind is that this intensity is kind of saturating right around that 920 micromoles per meter squared per second of photosynthetically active radiation of that PAR value. So what does this mean from a crop management standpoint? Building canopies and managing our crops to have more uniform or more even distribution throughout the canopy can be really important to ensure that yield is non-limiting. And that's done essentially by increasing internode length, increasing petiole length, and making leaves a little bit more upright. The combination of all of these factors can help improve canopy photosynthesis by increasing that interception efficiency. We manipulate this with the hybrids that we select. We also manipulate this with our seeding rates and our row spacings primarily. The other thing that this influences in some ways is the planting date and changing planting date, but that could influence the duration of intensity absorbed, and maybe less influential on this light interception of the canopy itself. But if you can get to the maximal leaf area for the plant at an earlier date without senescing earlier, you get more days capable of full light capture in that season. Just keep in mind as well that canopy photosynthesis is kind of the summation of all of these parts. The leaves are factoring into it. In some cases, our stems are, if they're green, leaf number, and all of these things have additive contributions that can affect that productivity of the canopy. And so the faster you can get to that maximal leaf area with more days available for sunlight capture, the better yield is going to be in those situations. And so this kind of brings us to the last point of this topic area, is this idea of total available light. And that's really what we're concerned about when we start to think about haze and its influence on crop production. We know that Earth's position dictates the experienced energy at any given latitude. In the northern hemisphere here, as our globe tilts towards the sun, as we see kind of up here around the summer solstice, the light that's coming into our environment tends to be closer distributed and closer to perpendicular to the ground as compared to when we get closer to the winter solstice. Light tends to be more diffuse, hitting at a steeper or a lesser angle that's closer to parallel, not necessarily closer to perpendicular, which does influence availability of photons themselves. The other issue when we start to think about total available light is understanding the difference between how radiant energy is measured and reported. In a lot of the graphs I've been showing in this presentation, I've been talking about photon number. Basically, it's a number of quantum or number of waves or a count of waves, and it's measured as micromoles per meter squared per second. And so we talk about that from a physiology standpoint because each photon or each wave is used to excite an individual electron that goes through the photosynthetic process. But more often than not, we're not just measuring quantum when we talk about light energy. It's usually reported as a radiometric value, which is reported using energy units. This is where most weather stations record this type of data, and it doesn't necessarily separate out for that photosynthetically active region that I had mentioned previously. I said roughly 1,000 micromoles per meter squared per second is the photosynthetically active region that plants maximize their photosynthetic ability at. But it's really hard to know what that means if we can't convert energy to particle number. And so when we talk about measuring light as a wave or as energy, this is kind of how we see these units reported, either as watts or watts per meter squared, joules per second sometimes. But we know that this is the amalgamation of all of the sunlight energy, and not every photon has the same amount of energy. In general, when we talk about radiometric measurements, a typical sunny day is going to exhibit an intensity of like 1,000 watts per meter squared. So this is kind of an instantaneous measurement at the brightest point that daylight is. Only 43% of that energy is actually falling into the PAR region. That photosynthetically active light is only about 43% of that energy. And so when we start to do that dilution or that conversion, That gets us to 430 watts per meter squared. To get to the value as a particle number, to kind of relate it back to what we've been talking about, we can multiply that overall intensity by about 2.1, and that gets us to our quantum photosynthetic photon flux value of roughly 2,000 micromoles per meter squared per second. Okay, so in a given day at the brightest intensity, the light intensity that our crops can experience is about double what the leaf can use at its maximum point. That's kind of the point of going through all of this, okay? And so if we start to think about what haze is doing to available light intensity, if it reduces the light intensity, some reduction may not necessarily directly translate into a loss in photosynthesis because our leaves may already be saturated with light because there's not enough CO2 available. We know that light is scattered in the atmosphere. It's either scattered because of wavelength dependent scattering, that could be Rayleigh scattering, or there's Mie scattering, which is independent of wavelength itself. Rayleigh scattering is why our sky looks blue during the day. Essentially, blue light has higher energy. It's more likely to be scattered sooner. And so we see the sun light turning blue. And if we were to look directly at the sun, it would look more like white or yellow in color because primarily we're getting red and green light coming to our eyes at the surface. We know that as the sun sets, more of that green light is going to scatter. And so as the green and blue light scatter, we get the really nice cyan color as the sun is setting. And then the sun itself turns that orange to red color because that's the only light that's able to reach us because a lot of that is passing through the atmosphere. So we know that type of scattering, and we know that influences sky color and sunlight color. But when we talk about Mie scattering, this is kind of what's more influencing the haze conditions that we see. Essentially, it's scattering all wavelengths of light. It's wavelength independent, and it leads to that change in condition. In general, Mie scattering will reflect some light back out of the atmosphere, and so it can reduce overall light intensity, but it's not necessarily differentially affecting some wavelengths more than others. But what impact could this have on crops? Reducing light intensity is not necessarily a good thing if it reduces the amount of photons coming into our system. But we do see that the light, instead of becoming direct and interacting with crops directly, creating these really bright areas of sun and these darker areas of shade, we tend to see more of the haze influencing diffusion of that light. And what we know is that diffuse light can actually result in greater amounts coming into lower parts of the canopy. We're not oversaturating certain areas of the leaf with that direct light interception. Instead, it's kind of being more evenly distributed throughout the canopy and possibly positively influencing growth and development. This is part of the reason why some greenhouses will use some sort of diffuser on their glass to minimize sun and shade differences, increase light uniformity, and ultimately a slight reduction in intensity can increase productivity because of that diffusivity of the light. When you have a lot of shading, it could be detrimental to some plants and over intensity in some. And so this is not necessarily an strange concept that we see in controlled environments. We also know that plants will utilize diffuse light for photosynthesis more effectively than direct sunlight. This is a case from grapevines that's showing net carbon exchange in response to the proportion of light coming in as diffuse, meaning more diffuse light at 100%, less diffuse and more direct light being supplied at kind of the lower end of this proportion. And in general, what we saw with the plants is that carbon exchange increases with diffuse light. And so all of these things are factoring into our productivity considerations when we talk about haze and photosynthetic response and its influence on crop yield and development. The last thing to keep in mind is sometimes we think about lights and plants in relation to something called the photothermal quotient. In general, this is a ratio of the amount of daily light we're receiving divided by the number of heat units or growing degree days that were accumulated during that same period. And so it tells us a value of photons per growing degree day. In general, a higher value means more productivity could be expected because in general, the less GDDs you have, the slower phenologically that plant is going to develop, the more days it will exist in the field, and the more days it has to absorb light to do photosynthesis. When we have warmer temperatures, it tends to accelerate crop growth rates almost 2 to 3 times faster with a 10 degree Celsius increase in temperature, which means fewer overall photons over the course of the full season will be absorbed in those cases. And that would correspond to a lower photothermal quotient value because of an accelerated plant life cycle. So all of these things are coming into play when we think about plants, their interactions with light and light absorbance, and how it will influence productivity. In 2023, we had a case of haze coming in, and it led to a lot of grower questions. In general, we had some really weird conditions in May, June, and early July. Essentially, we had May weather conditions that were really clear, but really dry and relatively cool. And then in mid-June through early July, we had haze come in, and there were a lot of questions regarding what would happen to our crops, our crop growth and development in that season. And so we took an attempt to look at the weather data from 3 locations in Ohio. This is kind of northwestern Ohio, west central Ohio, and northeastern Ohio. And in May, as I mentioned, we had higher than usual light availability, which in a way could have stressed out the plants because they were receiving almost a 12% increase in total light availability. When we had the hazy conditions in June, sorry, that was paired with a decrease in temperatures. So we had cooler conditions, but really bright conditions, which slowed growth and development a little bit for most of our crops in that time frame. When we started looking at the weather conditions in June and July, we saw anywhere from a 3% reduction in total light availability up to a 9% reduction in light availability during that month on average. So the haze was partially reducing the light that we were seeing paired with weather patterns, rainfall, and overall cloudiness. In general, we had less light available in June and July for most of our research stations. But we also saw a really large decline in growing degree days themselves. And so that was some of the question was, is the haze itself causing this reduction in GDDs? And what we determined was that the GDD reduction from that 3 to 10% reduction in intensity was not the primary cause of that GDD reduction. In general, we expected it to be a 0.4 to 1.4% reduction in GDDs, not a 12 to 13% reduction. The other thing to keep in mind is with the haze, we saw a reduction in light intensity, but it's possible that that light was coming in via diffuse light conditions. In California in 2018, they reported a 3.6% reduction in direct light, but the diffuse light increased by almost 35%, which could have helped to stem any yield losses that we were experiencing from that light intensity reduction. In Ohio, it was determined the majority of the GDD reduction was coming because of the weather patterns. We were getting cooler air from Canada, which was bringing the smoke in, but it was also bringing in these cooler temperatures. And it was the primary driver of our seasonal response that year. When looking at that photothermal quotient, we also saw that when we had these cooler conditions, and even though we had a reduction in overall light intensity, we had greater than average photothermal quotient values for our production environments, which suggested potentially greater uh, productivity in those environments. At the end of the season, we didn't really see a change in moisture content in soybeans, but we did see a slight delay in crop development of corn. But in 2023, we ended up having state record yields for corn, soybeans, and our winter wheat crop, which was growing in that June and early July timeframe. So in Ohio in 2023, we did not really see a negative yield impact of the haze affecting our conditions. But recent reports from Nebraska suggested that a 7-day reduction in light by 46% during the grain fill period of corn could reduce yields. In a simulation that they ran, they suggested a 5% yield reduction. And recently, some of the professors there published a summary of corn production in 2025, looking at light intensity and temperature trends and precipitation. And in general, they were kind of pointing towards this photothermal quotient. They saw a reduction in overall light intensity paired with elevated temperatures, which led to accelerated plant development and lower than anticipated yields. And so oftentimes this idea of light and light availability is really tied to the temperatures during the growing season and how those influence plant growth and development. So this kind of leads to the question, what can we do from a management perspective? Is there anything we can really do? Some of the things that can be done is to vary production practices to increase light interception almost as soon as possible. Extending the season so that you are maximizing light capture, if possible, is also a good strategy. But also changing up planting dates so that you don't necessarily get affected by the haze at the same growth stage in your crop, if at all possible. So anything you can do to increase light capture, adjusting seeding rates, row spacings, varietal selection, and seasonality, just overall getting to that high leaf area index earlier in the season could be beneficial to maximize that light absorption of the canopy, even if less is available because of haze during the season. So I think that's pretty much all I had planned to formally present today, but I'd be happy to take any questions if there are any from the audience.
So I'm just going to ask, are there any questions coming from the audience here? And we'll kind of run out to you with a mic here.
Well,
Anything
people are
online?
Thinking, I have. Are we good? Okay, I'm good. I can't tell if I can hear myself. What are your thoughts on corn seeding directions, north, south, east, west, in a place like Manitoba?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's a good consideration depending on early season growth and development. In some ways, north-south will provide a little bit more uniform light distribution through the canopy as the sun goes from one side of the horizon to the other. But the other factor that may play into that decision is what is the weather and what's the temperature conditions at that point in time. Early on in the day, you're going to have more CO2 available for those leaves to absorb and incorporate into their biomass, as we saw from those eddy covariance charts that were produced in Nebraska. And it's less likely that temperature or water stress would be influencing those plants. And so maximizing light capture early in the day could be beneficial. But as you start to get towards the afternoon and waning hours of the day, those plants may be under greater stress just from lower water availability, higher temperatures, And so net productivity may be negatively impacted because of that condition. And so direct light capture and direct light interception may not necessarily help productivity for the plants when it's on that side of their bodies. East-west orientation, you're going to have more uniform distribution on certain parts of the plants, but other parts are going to be more in shade. And it's possible that localized adaptation could be beneficial during the day. So I think there's been some work suggesting north-south orientation can be beneficial, but again, a lot of agronomy is not necessarily what's best for this particular question. It comes down to what's practical, what can I do, and what's feasible. And in the grand scheme of all of those questions, if it's a lot harder to plant north-south compared to east-west, it's probably better to just do what you can.
I think we have another question online as well.
Yes, we have one more that's online, and that was related to, I guess, reduced heat. When you're dealing with crops like canola and wheat that can experience heat stress, does the increase in haze related to that wildfire smoke reduce that heat stress on the crop?
So that's a good question. The haze will, in some ways, reduce direct light interception by the leaf tissue. And oftentimes leaf tissue is directly related to light interception, more so than ambient temperature. And so you may be able to reduce the direct leaf stress, the temperatures at the leaf level for the leaves that are directly intercepting that light by some degree. But by and large, when we talk about crop growth and development, either in 2025 in that Nebraska article or in 2023 in that article from Ohio, it seems that the overall temperatures themselves are the primary drivers of crop growth and development and stress. So light may play a role, it might play a minor role, but it's more the overall weather patterns that are going to influence your crop to a greater degree.
Anything else from the audience here?
Claire Keene asked on the Q&A here as well about NDSU Extension having lots of calls with questions about wildfire smoke this spring. Assuming warm temperatures and enough growing degree days, is it possible that the smoke reduced corn yields?
So again, I think a lot of the yield implications may depend on the timing of the smoke and the haze. If it was occurring earlier in the growing season, I'd be less inclined to think it would have a major impact on yield. But if it was occurring later in the season during the grain fill period, there may be a higher likelihood that yield would have been negatively impacted in those scenarios. But early season smoke, at least from the things that I've been seeing and the data that we've collected and kind of our experiences have been, it hasn't been as detrimental as maybe feared. A lot of the seasonality after the haze is going to impact that productivity and drive that productivity difference.
Okay, well, let's give Dr. Lindsey another round of applause.
Okay, thanks again for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And we have a virtual gift for you that we'll send you in the mail. So.